All right, guys, let's get started. This is a short video on the corrective tax. I want you to take a moment and inspect what we have here. We have our demand curve, which we can also think of as the private marginal benefit curve. We have our supply curve, which we can think of as our private marginal cost curve. I call this the original supply curve because before there's any corrective tax implemented, this is our supply curve. We have this other curve here. That's our social marginal cost curve. And after the corrective tax, it's going to become our new supply curve. Why is that? Well, we're going to set a tax that's equal to the externality. If we impose a tax on producers, this becomes like an additional variable cost. It's a cost that's going to be reflected in the new supply curve. That is, we're going to shift the original supply curve up to the social marginal cost curve. That's the beauty of a corrective tax. Why? The price system works whenever prices reflect all the costs and benefits to society. If there's some negative externality, we can think of our coal-powered electricity example. There's maybe sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide that's being emitted, causing pollution and causing a burden on the rest of society. That's a cost that's not reflected in the price. The idea of the tax is to reflect that cost in the price. Once we've done that, the original supply curve becomes the new supply curve. Thus, the private marginal cost, once we include the tax, is equal to the social marginal cost. And then we just simply go to our intersection of social marginal cost and social marginal benefit, which in this case is the demand curve because there's no positive externality, to arrive at the efficient quantity, which is going to be the quantity delivered by the corrective tax. The tax revenue that's generated is reflected in the orange. It's going to be equal to the total externality, at least in this scenario, where we assume there's a per unit externality that's equal across all units of production, and we're applying a per unit tax that's equal across all units of production. Consumer surplus, we're going to calculate it the way we normally do. We look at the quantity of interest, which here is Q tax. We look at our private marginal benefit curve, which is just the demand curve. And we look at the, in this case, price paid by consumers, which is the pump price, referencing when you go to the gas station, you see a price that's already included the tax. So this is P, the price the producers receive, which is right here on the y-axis. P plus the tax gives us the pump price. Consumer surplus then, the benefits, which is reflected the area below the demand curve, minus the price paid. That gives us consumer surplus. Producer surplus, just like we normally do, we look at the price received. So when you go to the gas station, they receive the price, the pump price, and then they pay their private marginal costs, but now they include the tax. So once you take those away, you're left with producer surplus. So just to clarify, the price producers charge It is down here. The price they receive at the pump, though, is inclusive of the tax. So that's why I said at the gas station, they receive P plus the tax. But the price they're charging based on their own private marginal cost is really down here. And then they add in the tax at the pump. Kind of nuanced point, but one I wanted to make sure I made to you. Okay, so now what we're going to do, I think I've hit everything on here except the flowers. This is an example of a positive externality, just to remind you. Okay, let's wipe this away and rebuild it. So we'll call this our original supply curve, and we'll call this our demand curve. So when we have a free market, we have a supply curve that's reflective of the private marginal costs, and we have a demand curve that's reflective of the private marginal benefits. And in the free market, we'd arrive at this unregulated equilibrium quantity. Producers would set the price PUR. But in the case of coal-powered electricity, we maybe have a negative externality reflected by this social marginal cost curve. Things look a little blurry, so I'm going to try to refocus for a moment. There we go. Whenever there's a negative externality, we want to produce where the social marginal cost curve intersects the social marginal benefit curve. There's no positive externality, so the demand equals the private marginal benefits, which equal the social marginal benefits. So the efficient quantity is going to be right here. How are we going to get there? The idea of the corrective tax is to make sure that all the costs of production and consumption are reflected in the price. The way we're going to do that is by imposing a tax. That's going to shift up the supply curve so that the new supply curve is coincident with the social marginal cost curve. When we do that shift, this guy becomes the new supply curve, because of the tax. Sometimes you'll hear me call this internalizing the externality. The tax is going to make the negative externality and make it internal to the transaction between the gas producer and the gasoline consumer. All right, so this area right here is our negative externality, X, or rather total X. The per unit X is right there, which is equal to our per unit tax. the price paid by consumers is going to be P plus the tax. This is our pump price. So you see that the pump price is going to lie above the unregulated equilibrium quantity. Excuse me, the unregulated equilibrium price. Another thing to note, what is the price received by the producer? The price received by the producer, well, at the pump, they're going to be collecting this much, but then they're going to be paying this tax to the government, and so they're left with this P. Notice, it's not P unregulated equilibrium. Why is that? Well, if we look right here, this is where the pump price intersects the demand curve and the new supply curve. But if we go down, we see that the revenue that's actually generated for the producer is based on this price, P. These guys are the same. And so what you'll notice is that under the corrective tax, the price received to generate revenue for the producer is less than the revenue generated per unit sold in the free market. That is the unregulated equilibrium. Thus, the revenue received per unit under the corrective tax is less than the revenue received in the unregulated market equilibrium, that is, in the free market. Okay, so let's try to get this so it looks a little more like the graphic we started out with. So I detailed that this is the total externality, and I told you again that the tax per unit is going to be equal to the per unit externality. As a consequence, this guy right here is the tax revenue. So the total externality total X equals the total tax revenue. Again, the graphic's getting a little messy here, so I'm going to erase some of this. I'll erase this guy over here too. What is consumer surplus? It's the area underneath the demand curve down to the price paid, which is our pump price. That pump price is paid for each unit consumed out to Q star, which under the corrective tax is exactly equal to Q tax. The second unit of consumer surplus again, this demand curve is a function. I plug in 2 to our function, which is graphically represented by a line, and it spits out this guy right here. So this is the benefit on the y-axis of the second unit consumed. The price paid is still the pump price. So the consumer surplus is the difference between those. It's the net benefit of consumption. The third unit, fourth, fifth, so on and so forth, until we stop where production stops at Q tax. This is our consumer surplus under the corrective tax. Producer surplus the gas station is going to receive the pump price. They're going to pay their marginal costs, and they're going to pay the tax to the government. The difference between the pump price, the per unit tax, and their private marginal costs is reflected by that green skinny rectangle. The second unit is there. The third unit of producer surplus is there, so on and so forth, out to Q tax. This is the producer surplus under the corrective tax. Total surplus, we haven't hit on that yet. Total surplus is always going to be the difference between the social marginal cost curve and the social marginal benefit curve. What's the social marginal benefit curve here? It's just the demand curve, because there are no positive externalities. So the social benefit from the first unit of consumption is up here. The social cost, it is exactly equal to the new supply curve. The fact that we have a corrective tax does not change the social marginal cost curve. Does not change it. The whole idea of the corrective tax is that the private marginal cost curve shifts and becomes identical or coincident with the social marginal cost curve. So the social marginal cost curve is going to be right here. Let's switch to brown. Find a marker that works. Yeah. So this right here, this is the social marginal benefit of the first unit of consumption. This is the social marginal cost of the first unit of consumption. So the net benefit to society from the first unit of consumption is this guy right here. The second unit is the difference between the social marginal benefit curve, which is again our demand curve here, and the social marginal cost curve, which is down here. The third unit produces a net benefit to society that's there. So this guy right here is our total surplus. Make sense? Our tax revenue is right here, which is identical to the total externality. Our total surplus is right here, which now that we've shifted the private marginal cost curve up, it turns out that the total surplus is equal to the joint surplus. Why is that the case? Well, the math is pretty straightforward. Total surplus under the tax is going to be equal to, well, who are we concerned with? We're concerned with producers, so producer surplus. We're concerned with consumers, so consumer surplus. We're also concerned with the externality. This guy. And then we're concerned with the total tax revenue. Guess what? The total externality and the total tax revenue, they're going to cancel out. So what we're left with is that let me try to focus this again. Aha! The total surplus under the tax is going to be equal to producer surplus under the tax plus the consumer surplus under the tax, which is exactly equal to the joint surplus under the tax. All right, we don't have the exact same graphic at the end of our video, but I think it's still pretty useful. I hope the video was productive, and good luck studying. One more thing to mention, there are multiple ways to do the graphical analysis under the corrective tax. I highlighted 2 in lecture. This is the one where we're thinking about the tax being imposed on the producer. I think a lot of students find this a little more intuitive than the other representation. You can use either way. It doesn't matter. They both have the exact same results. Which one am I referencing when I say the other method? If you got the last 20 minutes and don't want to endure anymore, that's okay. But just to reconcile what you maybe have in some of your notes, I'll quickly go through it. The other way we can conceive of this, we want to arrive here, which is equal to the socially optimal quantity, because that's where the social marginal cost curve is going to intersect our social marginal benefit curve. Another way to conceive of this is that at this quantity, producers are going to charge this price P, and then the government is going to impose a tax on consumers. So consumers are going to pay the tax. So they're going to pay the exact same pump price, which is going to be P plus the tax. So in this scenario, the tax revenue is represented as just the rectangle rather than a parallelogram. But the area of this rectangle is in fact identical to the area of this parallelogram. Ooh, Get this focused again. Producer surplus is this area, and consumer surplus is this area. So you may have had this in your notes. The numbers turn out exactly the same. Total surplus is still the sum of this guy and this guy. We've just shifted things around a little bit on the graphic. If this is how you want to represent the total tax revenue and how you illustrate the corrective tax, that's fine by me. A lot of students find the first method a little more intuitive to them. But either way is fine.